Cute. All right. Well, here's an old one. So Adam was sitting alone in the Garden of Eden, looking around at the various animals, trying to figure out which one was supposed to be a companion for him. And God showed up and said, "Hey, don't do that. I'm gonna do something really special for you. I'm going to make you a woman to be your partner, and she is going to cook your meals and fetch your slippers and laugh at all your jokes for all eternity. But it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you an arm and a leg." And Adam said, "Well, what can I get for a rib?" That's bad. You know, I know. It's just it's not as bad as the other one, which I can't even figure out. So I can't even figure out how to tell. So anyway, all right. What are we talking about today? First of all, we're going to be talking about some stories that are in the Bible. The Bible. So we got to start out with this. The word Bible, not a Hebrew word, not a Greek word. It's a Latin word. What might this word mean? Bible. Book. It means book. It just means the book. So the people who started calling it this, it was to them the most important book, and they decided that if somebody said book or the book, that there was only this one book that they could be talking about. Now, that is a little bit problematic, because the Bible is not really a book. It is a library. It's a library of all of these different books that were written by all of these different authors over the course of about 1,200 years. And during this 1,200 years, there was constant controversy and disagreement about who is God, what is the nature of God, what does God want from us. And as people debated and argued and sometimes, hurt each other, as people went through all of this stuff, every so often, in the course of this 1,200 years, somebody would try to silence the other side of the argument by writing something down. And so everything that is written down in this library, this anthology that we call the Bible, every single thing that's written down is there to end an argument. It's there to end a controversy. And that means that for everything that's said in there, there were other people who felt the opposite, who argued strongly against that. That was why people wrote things down. Now, within this library, this anthology that we call the Bible, there is a great deal of disagreement. I mean, even just if you look at what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Bible of Judaism, and the New Testament, the Bible of Christianity. There's a great deal of disagreement between those two things. In the easy example, in the Old Testament, there is no heaven or hell. The entire Old Testament never mentions heaven or hell, or deals with what happens after we die. The big question in the Old Testament is a contract with God, that if Abraham and Abraham's descendants worship and feed God, give food sacrifices in certain ways, they will get to keep a piece of land, and their children will get to keep that piece of land. Then we turn the page, and we're in the New Testament. The land is lost. The land belongs to Rome. And people keep coming up to Jesus and saying, like, hey, when are you going to lead us with a sword and fight Rome and take back the land? And Jesus has to keep saying, that whole thing is over. That whole deal about the land, that deal is gone, expired. It's not coming back. We're doing something different. And then in the New Testament, then we start to hear about this other thing of, like, maybe there's some other promised land, but it's not here in Israel. It's not even here on the planet Earth. That's a major controversy. That's a major disagreement. So thinking of the Bible as the book, one book, is already going to get us into kind of a mess, because there is so much disagreement within that book. And all of the stuff in that book is trying to silence the disagreement of somebody else. All right, so that, if we can follow all of that, now we're going to look at some, now we're going to look at some kind of small disagreements in the first couple of chapters of the first book of the Bible. And as we're going to see, these differences are going to seem pretty small, maybe even small enough that with a little creative sermonizing, they could even be harmonized into like one agreeing story. Not really, as we'll see. But we're going to look at these small differences, and then as we kind of look deeper at them, we're going to ask ourselves, well, what is it? What has changed? What are the questions? What's the debate? What's going on that makes people tell these different stories at these different times? The creation, like the creation in the Bible. The Bible contains many different creation stories over the course of 1,200 years. There were numerous different creation stories going around. In some of the, and here's something interesting that these creation stories have in common. They are not creation stories from nothing. They're creation stories in which God, somehow turns like a swampy, mixed up, dark chaos into some kind of land, some kind of plantation. All right. As I was saying this morning, in the biblical books of Psalms, Job, and Isaiah, which Bible scholars believe to be some of the oldest texts in the Bible, God approaches this dark, swampy chaos, and there is some kind of sea monster. It's got a sea serpent called the Leviathan that is kind of moving around in it, and God has to fight this thing and defeat this snake monster and tear it into pieces. And then, having won that victory, then God is able to start dividing things and creating land. Or maybe creates the land from the pieces of this dismembered sea monster, like in the Babylonian creation story, the Enuma Elish, in which the creator God has to create the world by defeating and dismembering his grandmother, who is this giant sea monster. All right, sea monster stories. Then we have this fascinating old creation story in the book of Proverbs, in which creation, the work of creation is done not by one deity, but by two. And one of them is a female deity, and she says, God and I, we did this together. We did this work of creation together, and we built this stuff, and we cooperated, and therefore, we're always going to both be taken seriously. That didn't come true. The creation story in the book of Proverbs did not become the opening creation story in the Bible. Instead, over the centuries, there was continued disagreement, and finally, people started to say, no, God never had a female God partner. There can only be this one God. So that side of the story gets silenced, and yet still remains in the Bible. They didn't cut it out. They kept it for some reason. Tucked away in the book of Proverbs. Have we ever encountered it? It's one of my favorite books of the Bible. It has my favorite quote from the entire Bible, which is, like a dog that eats its own vomit is the fool who returns to his folly. That, you know, it's like, it's the only Bible verse that I can just pull right off the top of my head. I'm like, I remember that one. Proverbs, it's just a book of advice. And the advice, if you ever read the book of Proverbs, it's fantastic because it gives you all these pieces of advice. Proverb means a piece of advice. And then, but if you get to the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, it is a mother instructing her son on the qualities to look for in a bride. And she basically says, you need someone who can like rise up early in the morning, someone who can work hard, think hard, you know, help you make your decisions, like do all this stuff. So the moral of the book of Proverbs is, if you can't remember any of this advice, just marry a woman who is intelligent and you'll be okay. And tucked away in the middle of the book of Proverbs is this creation story, very much like the creation story in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, except that instead of just one God, there's a God and a goddess working together. All right, now, the creation story in the first chapter, you open up the Bible, chapter 1, page 1, in the beginning, when God created the skies and the land, and it was all a mixed up mess, you know, etc. God creates the world in 7 days. Actually, it's supposed to be 6 days. God is supposed to create the world in 6 days and then have the Sabbath. But, if you're reading the book, you get to the seventh day, God actually wakes up really early in the morning and does some last minute work because it's not done. So like this whole thing about keeping the Sabbath holy, God breaks it on the very first Sabbath. It's just, it's such a hard rule. Anyway, that's a little interesting thing that they didn't remove. I mean, that the editors didn't take out. It's still tucked away there in the Bible, like God thinking he's going to get away with waking up and working on the Sabbath. Okay, but then you turn the page. The world is created, the animals, the people, everything is there, everything's done, everything is good. It was very good, you know. And then you turn the page, Genesis chapter 2, actually in the middle of the chapter, actually in the middle of a verse. It's all gone. And God creates the world again. The whole thing just starts again. And it's different. And now there's the Eden and you know, Adam and all of that stuff. Then, when we get to the New Testament, the biblical gospel according to John opens with yet another creation story. Actually, they take this creation story of God and the female partner creating the world together, and they replace the female partner with the Christ. So the gospel according to John begins with replacing God's female partner with God's son, who is, you know, also like, you know, whatever. Okay, well, what's the purpose here? We might think that the book, the Bible, contains the creation story for Judaism and Christianity. Actually, it contains many creation stories. That makes perfect sense because people were arguing about this for 1,200 years, and they kept coming up with stuff. Stories kept kind of replacing other stories. The story in the second chapter of Genesis is older than the story in the first chapter of Genesis. But the last people, the last group to like come into power, put their story first because they wanted it to be the most authoritative. But then they did not eliminate the older story. They just kept them side by side. That's okay. All right, now, so we're going to look at this today and probably over the next couple of second Sundays. What's going on here with these two creation stories that we encounter literally in the first 10 minutes of reading the Bible. They are different. Most of the differences are going to seem very minor. We're going to look at the differences in perspective on power, food, gender, and the meaning of life. What's the meaning of life? Because a creation story, the story about how was the world created, in every culture has a creation story. How was the world created? But that's not really what the story is about. Every culture has a creation story. The most important question is why? Why was the world created? And what does that tell us about how a human being should interact with that world? So regardless if we hear a creation story from some other culture, regardless if we find it to be fanciful or fictional or whatever, the most important part of a creation story is why? What's the meaning of life? What am I, a human being, doing here? What can this story tell us? All right. You open up the Bible, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. Here's something interesting. 1,000 years ago, the high Archbishop of Ireland was charged by the Vatican to figure out how old exactly is this world. And he had to do it by going back through the Bible, all of those things where it says so-and-so lived such and such number of years and then begat so-and-so who lived such and such number of years and begat so-and-so. And so he started with where can he find a biblical intersection with some other character from history whose lifespan could be dated with some accuracy, and then working backwards, if so-and-so lived such and such number of years. And what he came up with was that the creation of the heavens and the earth began in the year 4004 BC. Better than that, on October 23rd. I don't know how he came up with that, but October 23rd, 4004 years before the Common Era. That would make the planet Earth about 6,030 years old. Obviously, there are some issues with that now, but why? Why would the creation story? Why would the creation begin at that time? One Bible scholar, John Dominic Crossan, encourages us to think about that by asking ourselves, what was going on in the Middle East about 6,000 years ago? Now, biologists, geologists are generally not saying today that was the beginning of skies and land, or the beginning of creatures, or the beginning of humanity. But historians can look back and say, oh, the Middle East about 6,000 years ago, that was the beginning of what we might call civilization. Full-time farming and cities and money, economies, things like that. That this was the time that there was this change going on between the human being as an intelligent primate hunter-gatherer, nomadic being, to the human being as a settled farming culture that produces most of its food through agriculture. So John Dominic Crossan says that 6,000 years ago might not be the beginning of rocks. It might not be the beginning of water and animals and human beings, but that it's not such a bad guess for when was the beginning of history? When was the beginning of people settling down and beginning to interact with the land in this new way? And that How is a human being meant to interact with the land? That's going to be a major theme in these creation stories. If you read the first chapter and a half of the book of Genesis, you'll see that there's this pattern that it'll say, like, God shows up and everything's a mess, and God says, let there be light, and then says it was good, and then says I'm going to divide this from this. It says it was good. God keeps doing things, and then God keeps looking at it and saying this is good. When we look at this story, it's not necessarily a scientific text, and the people who composed this story did not necessarily think of it as a scientific, as a geology text or a biology text. It sounds more like a song. It sounds more like a church hymn, like a procession, a song in which there is movement. And if the song has verses, and then the song has this recurring refrain, it was good, which lets you know the work of that verse is accomplished. Now you sing the refrain, it was good, now it's time to move on to the next verse. The story in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, I know that it can cause a lot of problems when one person says, like, this is a geology text or this is a biology text, and somebody else says, like, no, it's not. It doesn't really seem to be trying to do that. It's doing something else. And the who, what, when, where, how, all of that stuff is not really as important as what is obviously the why, which the story tells you again and again and again. Like, what are we supposed to learn from this? The message of that creation story is, it is good. In the beginning, it was good. Then in that story, God is going to put, at the end of the story, God's going to put people in charge. Then things are going to start to go bad. But the story is there to say what God planned and what God did is good. And if there's any badness after that, that's somebody else's fault. Okay, so first chapter of the Bible, it's more like an overture. It's more like a song than it is like a story. God shows up, does not create from nothing. We might think the opening line of the Bible is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's not actually what it says. It says, in the beginning, when God created the skies and land, God showed up, and it was like a watery chaos, and there was darkness on the face of the deep. The first sentence of the Bible tells us that God showed up, and there was this ball of dark, swampy water. Not even a ball. There was just this mass of dark, swampy water, what we would think of as air, land, water, those elements. They were just all hopelessly mixed together in this formless void, this chaos. And God approaches this thing and first turns on a light, let there be light. What was this light? We don't know. The sun and the moon are not going to be created until a couple of days later. But there's some kind of light. And then God starts dividing. He says, I'm going to separate the sky from the swamp, and then I'm going to separate the swamp into land and water. And the sky is going to be a solid dome. And it's going to have these windows that can open. And that's how rain is going to come through. So if we were, following the instructions of what is this thing, we would ultimately end up with like one of these things where you put money in a vending machine and a toy comes out, and one of these little bubbles, and it's like a little plate with a little plastic dome on top. That's the kind of world that gets created. It's not a world that's shaped like a tangerine. It's not a flat world either, but it's essentially like a serving dish with a dome on top. Later on in the, 5 chapters later, in the Noah story, God's going to say, nope, change my mind, it's all bad, and going to open up these windows. The waters above are going to combine with the waters below. The land's going to disappear, and it's all going to turn back into that chaos again. That's how this world works. That's how this world is organized. God keeps making all of this stuff. Now we get to something interesting. God says, now we are going to create humankind in our image. God speaks of God's self in the plural. Different people look at that in different ways. Some people look at that and say, well, wait a minute. If God says we are going to create humankind in our image and then creates male and female, maybe that means that there were 2, or that God is male and female. Maybe it means God does frequently speak of God's self in the plural, which was something that ancient kings and emperors also did. They would speak of themselves as we and us, and what they meant was, I, the king, speak on behalf of myself and the land and everything that I have dominion over. And therefore, kings and emperors spoke of themselves in the plural. God frequently speaks of God's self in the plural. It does not necessarily mean that there were multiple gods. But God creates male and female simultaneously at the same time and equally, and gives them the same instructions, the first commandments given to human being in the Bible: be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth and fill it, and have dominion over all of the creatures of the air, land, and sea. That's a lot. First of all, it's interesting, male and female receive the same authority, the same power, the same instructions. Second of all, the first instruction that they are given is to multiply, to make children. Now then, a couple of minutes later, we're going to be reading another biblical story in which suddenly making children is going to be this curse and a disaster. In the first chapter of the Bible, it is a blessing. It's a gift that God gives to people. He says, hey, you're going to have fun, you're going to make kids, you're going to be in charge of everything, it's going to be great, and God is going to give them dominion, command, authority over all of this stuff that's been created. That's a pretty big deal. All right. That's going to be pretty different from what we're going to encounter when we look at the Garden of Eden story in a minute, in which God's going to say, people should not be like God, and people should not think that they are in control. It's a really different story. All right. But God creates the world. The creation of people is on the 6th day of creation, and that the creation of people is not the big climax of creation. As a matter of fact, God has been kind of scrambling to do all of this creation. If we really pay attention to the verse and refrain and the way the song is built, God actually has 8 days of tasks to do. And there are 2 days in which God works double shifts, and God still has to get it all done in 6 days, because the big news, the big climax of creation is going to be God's creation of the Sabbath, the 7th day. In Judaism, the Sabbath is considered to be God's greatest gift to creation. It is the weekly day of rest, which is important. But more than that, it is the weekly day of equality. because as the rules of the Sabbath say, you will not work, your children, your relatives will not work, your servants will not work. Even if you own slaves, the slaves will not work, your animals will not work. Nobody's going to work. It is this one day in which everybody is equal, no matter where you are in the hierarchy. So it's not the creation of people that is the big climax. Even when God says to the people, you will have dominion over this, that's not the meaning of love. The meaning of life is like to do all of this stuff, but then one day out of every 7, everybody needs to sit back and acknowledge equality. John Dominic Crossan, Bible scholar, refers to this as the ultimate symbol of God's justice. What he means there is justice in the sense of equality, equal distribution, that everybody has. It's one day you make sure that everybody has what they need. It's not justice in terms of revenge. The other creation story, the Eden story, that's going to be a story of revenge justice. That's going to be a story of crime and punishment. Because we've read the 7-day creation story, the world has been created. We've heard like 8 times that everything is good and it's finished. And then we turn the page and the world is created again. Now, this is likely the older story, and this is a really pessimistic story of crime and punishment. This is a story in which God has a special, like, garden, and there are these 2 trees. Like, God puts, the first person in this garden and immediately says, like, this is the rule. You are not allowed to eat from this tree. There is a tree of like life, a tree of eternal life, and there is a tree of the knowledge of good and bad, help and harm, good and evil. Why? Why would God put the trees there? Why didn't God just put the trees somewhere else? This story, it's a story that necessitates some kind of crime. It's a pessimistic story. It's going to have a very unhappy ending for everyone. And in order for it to have this unhappy ending, it needs to have this, this rule that gets set up at the beginning. What is it that's growing on the trees? Is it a, whatever juicy red apple? Only if the creation story takes place in Russia, because that's where the apples were at the time. There were no apples anywhere in the ancient Near East. Where does the story take place? Actually, the Garden of Eden story tells us where it takes place. It says there are 4 rivers flowing out of Eden. And one of them is the Tigris, and one of them is the Euphrates. So we know the story takes place at the meeting place of those 2 rivers. It takes place in Iraq, not in Israel. And what was growing there at the time, the people would really have wanted to eat. That would be figs. And how do we know that the forbidden fruit was a fig? Because it says the people ate the fruit of the tree. Fruit is not named. And then they realized that they were naked, and they immediately pulled fig leaves down to wrap around themselves. So how do we get apples growing from a tree that has fig leaves? That's a Latin thing. That's because the Latin word for apple is malum, and the Latin word for bad is malus. And so they were like, oh, it must have been something bad. It must have been an apple. But like I said, all of the apples on Earth 6,000 years ago were all in in Russia. There's whatever. There's no way that the storyteller would ever have heard of an apple or imagined one. So they must have been thinking about something. It was probably a fig. Now, this tree, this knowledge, what is this knowledge? It seems to have something to do with a knowledge of what does it mean to be a human being, and how is a human being meant to interact with the rest of the world? What's the meaning of life? What are we supposed to do in relation to the rest of nature? The people take this thing, this fruit, they eat it. The first thing they do is they start ripping leaves off of trees. They seem to have transitioned into some kind of idea that the stuff in the garden belongs to them, that they can like take something from a tree for their own use. As we're going to see as the story goes on and the people get punished, they are going to stop being kind of harmless creatures eating fruit from the trees. They're going to become agriculturalists. As one scholar put it, they're going to shift forever out of nature into culture. This makes a kind of sense because this is the kind of thing that was going on about 6,000 years ago in the ancient Near East, was that there were people who were being faced with this question. Are we going to continue living on fruit from the trees, or are we going to start tilling the ground and producing wheat to make bread for ourselves, and like setting forests on fire to create plantations? This was the major issue 6,000 years ago. The story seems to be somehow connected with that. These two stories, the 7-day creation story in the first chapter of the Bible, the Eden narrative in the second and third chapters of the Bible, they are clearly two separate stories from two separate times. If you read the two of them in a hurry, you can kind of glaze over some of the little differences. Or if you're like a really good, preacher, you can sort of make them harmonize with each other. But they're filled with little differences, like the world was created in 7 days, and then you turn the page and the world was created in 1 day. In the 7-day creation story, animals are created, then people. In the Eden narrative, people are created and then animals. In one story, male and female humans are created simultaneous and equal. In another story, there is this kind of genderless singular creature called Adam, which means dirt. It's not a proper name and it's not a male name. It's just Adam, which means the dirt. And then gets separated into these two, male and female. In the 7-day creation story, God creates people in God's own likeness. In the Garden of Eden story, God does not create people to look like God, and God becomes very anxious, becomes concerned. I don't want the people to be like me. In the 7-day creation story, God creates people and immediately gives them dominion, rulership over the rest of creation. In the Eden story, God is going to get really angry at people when God thinks that people have tried to take control. That's a major difference in what was the plan? What's the meaning of life? In the 7-day creation story in the first chapter of the Bible, God creates people and immediately blesses them with the ability to multiply. In the Eden story, it's something different. Being fruitful and multiplying becomes this really problematic curse. So, the stories are really different from each other. What do these differences have to do with what is a human being? How is the human being meant to interact with the rest of the world? One of the primary ways that a human being interacts with the rest of the world is by eating it, or eating it and pooping it. How do we eat? How do we get our food? Do we get our food in a way that is destructive? or do we get our food in some way that involves cooperating with the rest of nature? These two creation stories have very different instructions on what does it mean to be a human being who needs to eat in order to survive. In the older of the two stories, the story that takes place in the Garden of Eden, God creates people and tells them what to eat. He says, you're going to eat from the trees. It means you're going to eat nuts and fruit. You're going to eat things that occur naturally. Now, later in the Garden of Eden story, God is going to curse people. He's going to take them away from the trees, send them out of the garden, and say, from now on, you're going to eat from the plants of the field. Now, by that, he means the agricultural field. He says, you're going to become a farmer. You're going to start sweating and toiling and working the fields and producing grain. You're going to start eating bread, except that the ancient Israelites at this point probably didn't eat bread. They drank it. They made beer out of it. But in whatever form, major change in diet. And farming is a curse. In the 7-day creation story, in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, God creates people. This is the younger story. And God says, what are you going to eat? You're going to eat the seed-yielding plants. He starts them out on a diet of grain. He says your diet is going to be primarily grain. You're going to be farmers. You're going to subdue the land, meaning you're going to clear the forests, plant the fields, eat the grain, and fruit, the stuff that comes from the trees, is going to be secondary. That's also going to be part of your diet. You're mainly going to eat by toil and grain. So in this story, in the 7-day creation story, farming is like the first instruction, is to start tearing up the land and planting wheat. In the Eden story, farming is a curse that God imposes on people who had been like foragers, people who had been like fruit and nut eating foragers, and now they're being cursed. Here again, what was going on at the time that these stories were being, first told and written, and the time when these stories seem to have taken place. One of the major things that was going on in the ancient Near East and in the land of Israel was this change from, people who had been foragers and were kind of being conscripted into this growing thing of like, nope, we're going to start clearing the forest, we're going to start farming, producing this surplus, this hierarchy, and all of this stuff. And they started to tell this story in which foragers were forced to become agriculturalists against their will, and that it must have been a curse, and that the curse must have been a punishment for some kind of terrible crime. How are we going? How are we doing? I got like another 15 minutes of, I think, really interesting stuff that I was hoping to go over today. Are we like, we're still going to be awake? Oh, okay, all right. I'm afraid to ask if we have any questions so far, because it's the Bible, and I feel like then suddenly like 2 hours are going to go by. So if it's okay, I'm going to do like another 15 minutes here, and then you can ask questions. All right. Obviously, when we think about the Garden of Eden story, one of the big things, one of the real scars, one of the real traumatic effects of this story is this division of gender, and that it is a story in which everybody loses. Every single character in the story loses. But arguably, women lose the most. In the 7-day narrative, Male and female created simultaneous and equal, given equal dominion over creation, and childbirth, reproduction, is a blessing for both of them that they have in common. The Eden story, it really could be argued that male and female, that some hermaphroditic being was created. We could call that simultaneous and equal. We don't generally do that as a culture. We tend to think of Adam as a male human being, and that then some part of Adam got taken out, and that the female was like a secondary thing. That's not necessarily what's going on in the story, but we do know this. At the end of the story, the male and female who have committed the same crime get cursed separately, and the male receives this curse of hard labor and struggling against the land, that the land that has been given to him, now he's going to have to fight with it in order to get food. And he's going to sweat, he's going to toil, he's going to do it to eat the plants of the field, to grow grain, until he dies. Is this the story in which death is invented? Obviously not, because God said to the people, if you eat of that fruit, you will die. And the people knew what that meant. God didn't then explain, like, death is this thing that hasn't been invented yet, but trust me, it's going to be bad. God said, if you eat of this, you will die. And the people were like, okay, we get it, we will die. So obviously, death existed. They knew what it was. Anyway, but Adam gets cursed to be this miserable farmer. Eve gets cursed with increased pain in childbearing, which is just mean. But also, I read this funny thing, not funny, kind of awful, but I read this thing recently where somebody was like, well, it turns out that, when people gained this knowledge of good and evil, it made their brains bigger. And that having bigger brains and bigger heads made childbirth more painful. It's like, what? Anyway, but yes, why is childbirth more painful for human beings than for other creatures? It is because of our big heads. It's probably not because of this fruit theft. The people, obviously, they had big enough heads to figure out, like what the problem was going to be. But this thing, God curses Eve. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And this, interestingly enough, when people try to look at like gender dynamics in the Bible, they don't start with like, well, look, here on the first page of the Bible, it says male and female are going to have equal dominion over all creation. They're like, look, here on the third page of the Bible, it says husbands are going to rule over their wives forever. So that's interesting, because that's not the first instructions that God gave to humanity about gender dynamics. Actually, the first thing the Bible says about male and female is that they should be equal with each other. But of course, whatever, the priests are more interested in this curse. All right. How does this come about? Well, we've got male, we've got female, and then comes this other creature who is described. Now, in English translations, it'll say, like, then there was the snake who was the craftiest of all of the creatures. It's actually not what the Bible says. The Bible says, then came the snake who was the nakedest of all of the creatures. And the same word that's used for they were naked and not ashamed. That's the word that's used when it says, then came the snake, and it was the nakedest of all the creatures. Well, what does it mean for a snake to be more naked than other creatures? Probably had something to do with this, that like anybody can be naked, but like some creatures can actually slough off their skin and come out even more naked than anybody else. The snake, being the nakedest of all creatures, was also believed in the ancient world to be immortal. It's believed that the snake could get old and then shed its aging skin and come out young and new and shiny and wrinkle-free and, and just keep on living forever. So the snake was this ancient symbol of immortality. In this story, it's also a symbol of wisdom, because God told the people, if you eat from this fruit, you will die. And the snake says, that's not actually what's going to happen. If you eat from the fruit, you're just going to start seeing things in a different way. Again, as I said this morning, it seems that the snake has already eaten of this tree. It already knows what's going to happen. And it knows that God is not going to keep his word. God's going to switch the punishment. All right, now, in classical depictions of the snake approaching Eve, we see just the snake and Eve. And then, I guess Adam kind of shows up later and says, what happened? And she says, here, eat this. That's not what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us that the snake came and spoke with Eve. They talked about it. And then she decided, yeah, we're going to do this thing. And then she gave some of it to Adam, who was right next to her. Why? Why would the snake talk to her first? Now, I know what you're thinking. Is it because she would be more susceptible to, sin and desire and temptation? That's kind of a later explanation that the priests came up with. Why did the snake talk with Eve first? It's because the snake clearly understood that she was the one who was in charge. You see, when we look at the story of why was the woman created, Adam has this thing, this humanoid dirt person. But in the Garden of Eden story, God keeps walking off. We don't know where God is going. God keeps walking off and then showing up later. And at some point, God says, it's not good that the man should be alone. I need to make him a helper as his partner. God knows that God is going to keep walking off and coming back and asking what happened. He creates a creature actually to take care of this man. He says, this man needs some kind of babysitter. And when the man wakes up and the surgery is complete and he sees this woman, he bursts into song. The Bible contains a musical number here. He actually starts singing. And what he sings is, because the whole style of writing changes into a musical style of writing. He sings, this at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. And then the Bible says, therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. Now this says, well, therefore, as everybody knows, when a couple gets married, the man leaves his parents and moves in with his wife's family. That's interesting because that's not what tends to happen in the Bible. The Bible is very patriarchal and patrilocal and patrilineal, where wives keep moving in with their husbands. But the story tells us that in the beginning, it used to be this other way. Men moved in with their wives, and the wives owned the stuff, and the wives took care of them. What changed? There was this curse. So this, your husband shall rule over you, is an inversion. It's a reversal of this, that the man in a relationship should move into his wife's family property compound. This is it's a reversal, and it seems to contain some memory of an older way of doing things. A couple of months ago, we were talking about the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples of Western New York, and how it was only the women who could own property, and that when a couple got married, the man would move into the wife's mother's longhouse. A matrilocal society, that seems to be what's referred to here. And then this curse involves a shift into some kind of patriarchal society. So, in the Eden narrative, we've kind of inherited this idea that the female in the story is secondary and was always kind of doomed to become the assistant, the secondary one, and then to become the property. Actually, the story says that it was God's original intention that kind of women were going to own the stuff, do the brain work, do the negotiating, take care of men who were going to be kind of these hapless foraging creatures. But they were going to like pair off with these women who would take care of them and handle all the important decisions. That in the story was God's original intention. And then it gets flipped in this curse. The curse is a change from matriarchy to patriarchy. The serpent, the woman, and the tree. Archaeologists are finding that if you go into Israel and you dig and you look at like what was religion all about before the Israelites started doing this particular thing. And what they're finding is a lot of archaeological evidence that the popular religion before this had to do with serpents and trees and goddesses. And so one of the ways to look at this Garden of Eden story is as a kind of smear campaign against this older form of religion. And what do we know about that religion? What do we know about the goddesses of ancient Israel? What are the archaeologists finding that let us know what it was about these religions that was so like powerful that it had to be like turned around with this major campaign? That's going to be the topic of our next session. But if you're like just dying of curiosity about this, sorry, if you're just dying about it and you're like, oh no, I can't wait that long. I've got good news. I've written books about this, so you can actually find out what I'm about to say next. Anyway, the first book that I ever wrote, I was like, what do you do if you're, if you're only going to write one book in your entire lifetime? And like what's a good place to start? And so I wrote this book and gave it I think the very humble title of Genesis and the Rise of Civilization. This was it's a book exploring not only the Eden story, but the entire book of Genesis, not in terms of right or wrong or belief or heaven or hell, but in terms of what does it tell us about gender and class and food, like food production and food distribution. I'm really curious about that. But if you're just thinking like, no, my only interest in the Bible is about gender and sex. I also did write a book called Libel, Sex and Sexuality in the Bible, which contains some just shocking stuff. But I'll tell you this: the first line of the book is, "The Bible will never shock you as long as you never open it." Good. So I do have these here, and I accept cards, but there's no pressure because I'm not a salesman. Thank you very much. When we come back together, I think I'm going to do another sermon about snakes and also another adult ed session about what were these earlier religions in ancient Israel. So thank you very much. I will see you next month.